Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and joining me today for our discussion is Amitav Ghosh, author, public intellectual, writer, thinker, and of course author of the most recent book, The Great Derangement, which is one of the most important, provocative books on climate change, something that needs to be discussed and read and discussed widely, not just in India but around the world. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Siddharth.
Great to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the title, The Great Derangement. What exactly do you mean by this? You say how future generations will look back upon our unwillingness to confront the reality of climate change. Is that the Great Derangement? Or more than that?
I'll give you an example of what I mean by the Great Derangement. I've just arrived here from Chennai, and while I was there, I heard from some people that recently, soon after the floods, an enormous building is being built right on the banks of the Adyar River, very close to the sea. This building is a sort of hyper-luxury building, and it's going to have a 7-story basement. So, you know, what has anyone learned from what happened in Chennai last year? You know, they're building in more and more dangerous places, and this is something that's going on not just in India but around the world. We see this happening, for example, in Miami Beach in the US, where the water already there are regular floods on the streets and so on. Yet we seem to be sort of like lemmings hurtling towards our own doom, refusing to recognize the dangers that lie ahead, refusing to recognize the challenges that we are faced with. In a way, it's quite incomprehensible.
Technological hubris, is it? Are we fooling ourselves that we can defeat forces and tides of nature? I mean, why would somebody put good money into a building of this kind?
I know, and why would people who have money and who presumably are, at least well informed about the world, why would they buy these apartments, knowing that a building like that is literally doomed, that it doesn't have any kind of life beyond a few years? Because one of the most predictable impacts of climate change is sea level rise, and we see this all around the world already. The seas are rising. So why would anybody do that? And yet, this is what we are all doing, everywhere in the world.
Now, you argue very forcefully that climate change denialism is a separate thing altogether, where people are actively making arguments against the idea that climate is changing or that the earth is warming. But in a way, all of us are denialists, in the sense that we are unwilling in areas that we live and work, have our expertise in, unwilling to confront the realities that stare us in the face. And you have been quite critical about your own tribe of writers, fiction authors, etc. It's true that while fiction writers have avoided confronting the problem of climate change in their work, but there's been quite a few Hollywood films, films like 2012, or sort of doomsday scenarios built on the premise of global warming, but of course with the slightly wonky science. Do you think Hollywood has played some role in alerting people to these dangers?
Let me say, first of all, that I'm not in any sense criticizing my fellow authors. It's not for me to tell people what they should write about.
And you've been critical of yourself also.
Yeah, it's really more in the book. The book is really a sort of form of introspection. What is it within us? What is it within the world of a novelist that prevents us from looking at these realities as we should? Why are we also sort of mired in the same kind of derangement which actually leads to people building these giant mansions right on the beach? So yes, I think you're right that Hollywood has played an important part in at least addressing the question of climate change. And even more than the films, I think individual actors in Hollywood and directors have spoken about it in very eloquent ways and served to bring the issue to the world's attention. Leonardo DiCaprio is one, and then there's also Matt Damon has been speaking about it, Harrison Ford, and many others. And really, they're among the few in the world who have spoken up, a few public figures in the world who've spoken up about this issue. The problem with these apocalypse films and so on is that, because they are apocalyptic, because they are somehow usually set in some sort of future, what happens is that after people watch them, I don't think they necessarily really engage with the issues as they're unfolding around us. Because the thing about climate change is that it's not going to happen in some techno future. It's not going to happen in some other planet or some other universe. It's happening to us right now, all around us. So this is the question that really intrigues me about, say, serious fiction, literary fiction. Literary fiction has always prided itself on engaging with important issues, on engaging with politics, with gender issues, for example, many other issues. So how come this issue, which is actually the meta issue within which we are enveloped, why does this escape our scrutiny?
Is it a reflection also of the fact that politicians in virtually every society see no merit or value in being in raising climate change as an issue? I mean, in India, for example, where the initial impact of, I mean, you have climate refugees already.
Yes, masses.
And by all accounts, the victims of climate change are going to be in their tens of millions. Why is it that here politicians prefer to remain aloof from the topic? They don't engage with it. They don't see any great electoral value in mobilizing constituents. Is this something that you think is likely to change?
Certainly, I hope it's going to change, and some of these impacts are going to be so dramatic that it's going to be impossible for people to ignore them completely, I think. But as you say, already we see, during this drought in Bundelkhand, hundreds of thousands of refugees, essentially climate refugees, were arriving in Delhi every day, every week, living under flyovers, living in heaven knows where. No provision was made for them. No effort was made to sort of keep them where they were, to embark on relief measures that would have made it possible for them to stay back at home. And this process is just going to get worse and worse because, again, with sea level rise, many people are going to be displaced from coastal villages. Already we see this accelerating in Bengal and in Bangladesh. So yes, I think that has been till now the principal impact of climate change, which is just displacing people, millions and millions of people. When you're in Europe, for example, and you see the refugees who are washing up on the shores of Europe, a very large number of them are actually people who are displaced by climate change. They're from the Sahel, they're from the southern Sudan, where again they've had these droughts and so on. Many are from Syria for multiple reasons, but also because Syria had this very long-term drought starting in 2008.
If we talk of the denialists, Amitav, it seems to me that we have two kinds of people. On the one hand are those who deny flat out that there are any long-term deviations or that long-term weather patterns or climate patterns haven't changed, right? So that's people who say that there's simply no global warming. You have a second category who may agree that yes, in fact, sea levels are rising, temperatures are going up, climate has become more unpredictable, but they question whether this is linked to human activity and say, well, this is part of long-term cycles in climactic behavior. Is it possible? It's clear that it's not possible to have a dialogue with the first set of deniers, but have you encountered the second? Do you engage with them? Do you think that there's some merit in what they say, that the science needs to be more robust when it comes to the effect of human intervention on some of these changes?
I'm not a scientist, but certainly, I've read all the background stuff. At this point, it seems perfectly clear that there seems to be absolute consensus, really, amongst the great majority of climate scientists that, climate change is happening and that it's basically caused by greenhouse gas emissions, which means human activities. There's a 97% consensus on that amongst climate scientists. Naomi Oreskes' work establishes that very, very clearly. And more than that, the Paris Agreement of last year, one of its achievements is that it signals a global acceptance of these findings and a global agreement on these findings. So, that sort of denialism, maybe it had some power. That denialism had a lot of money behind it. Exxon has been funding it for a long time, and other big energy companies as well. But now it really doesn't have any traction, I don't think. I mean, it's one of the achievements of the Paris Agreement is really that it renders that kind of denialism, completely marginal. There is another kind of denialism, though, which would say that make various kinds of arguments. One is that, yes, it is happening, but what's more important is to lift people out of poverty. So we have to carry on expanding our carbon footprint, and that poverty will, if we solve poverty, that will itself solve the problem of resiliency. So that's one set of arguments that also exists. Another set of essentially denialist argument is that there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so we may as well carry on as we are.
Amitav, in the book you go back to the famous or infamous tornado of Delhi University, where you were literally in the eye of the storm, and you start your book with that very fascinating account, and of course you trace, although the book is not about you, but we see glimpses of your own engagement with climate change broadly defined. When would you say, what was the sort of moment of epiphany for you, or the moment of revelation for you as a writer, when you figured that this is an issue that I absolutely have to engage with? Was it the Andaman tsunami, or before that? At what point did you decide to go big on this topic?
Let me say that both the tornado and the Andaman tsunami played an important part in my life, and they play an important part in the book, but neither of them are related to climate change, I mean, I'm just, in the book I write about them merely as events, as disasters that, that I've had a first-hand experience with. So those are not climate change issues at all. But certainly, I think the tornado of 1978, I was 21, I was in Delhi University, and it was this bizarre experience where, for the first time in history, a tornado hit Delhi. And it just touched down for like about a mile and a half or something. And there I was, right in its path on that day in that place. And yes.
And the media grappling for the right word.
Yes, it was a phenomenon so unfamiliar that the media couldn't even find the right word for it. So that, that in some broad long-term sense, that planted some ideas in my mind, I think. But certainly for me, my engagement with climate change, I think, really began when I started writing The Hungry Tide, which is a novel that I wrote, published 2004. And it's set in the Sundarbans. And through that novel, I started first engaging with a lot of scientific literature on the subject of the atmosphere and what was happening around us, and storms and so on. But also, certain sorts of impacts, you could already feel that people that they were happening and that people were talking about them. Salt water was intruding further and further into the Sundarbans. Islands were disappearing in a long-term sense. So these issues really planted those questions in my mind. And as you know, the Sundarbans is exceptionally vulnerable to climate change.
One of the interesting parts of the book is when you talk about the history of colonialism and the impact it had in areas as diverse as India, Burma. And in a way, you're arguing that had colonialism not come about, industrialization would have happened quicker, faster in these regions. Yet you say, and you point to experience of Japan, you point to statements of Tagore, Gandhi, you say that had the natural process of industrialization not been interrupted in a country like India, say, it would not have been as consumptive or destructive as industrialization was in the West. Is that a valid argument?
That's not the argument I'm making.
Okay.
The background of the argument is just this, that often we in India sort of, or we in Asia, tend to point our finger at the West and say, well, you had this great party for 200 years, you expanded your carbon footprint, and now it's our turn. And of course, that's true. That's exactly how it happened. But what we forget is that actually our ancestors were incredibly eager to adopt the carbon economy. Dwarkanath Tagore was a very early adopter of steam technology. He founded a whole steamship line. He bought coal fields. On the west coast, the Wadias built steamers. They were very invested in steam technology. But, essentially, by the early 19th century, which is the nascency of, the carbon economy, India was the second largest importer of steam engines, in the world. So there was an enormous enthusiasm for these engines, for this technology. But in fact, through financial regulations, etc., the British created a circumstance where really
tariff rules and so on.
Where this technology couldn't spread, and they needed that because if we had adopted steam technology in a large scale, we would have become their competitors, But what they needed from India was raw materials. They needed cotton, etc. So it was actually built into the model of the imperial economy that only the metropolis would industrialize, whereas the colony would remain, rooted in agriculture, and that's exactly what happened. So I think it's fairly predictable that suppose decolonization had happened earlier. So let's say after the First World War. Yes, I think we would have seen an enormous expansion of India's carbon footprint in the 30s or 40s. Just as we did, just as we have seen very soon after decolonization.
But how much of the excess, if I can use that word, that we saw the West generate in terms of consumption? I mean, we're talking of per capita consumption of an order of magnitude much greater than anything that India and China even today are doing. How much of that historically, and even at the present, is the product of their ability to preempt resources from all over the world, to access? I mean, Indian industrialization, had colonialism not interrupted it, would likely have drawn on Indian resources and
yes.
not the entire world the way that colonialism did. So to what extent was the wastefulness, ecological wastefulness of industrialization or capitalism, whatever you want to call it, the product of colonialism, the product of the fact that other people's resources were being used as a common resource in a way?
See, I think it's important to recognize that capitalism is not just one thing. Today when we look at capitalism, we sort of seem to identify it with a certain kind of neoliberal capitalism, with basically a sort of Anglo-American capitalism. But there have been other iterations of capitalism, far less energy intensive, far less resource intensive. So, for example, East Asian capitalism, for example, in Japan and in Korea, was quite different. It was not resource intensive, it was labor intensive. Similarly, capitalism, today's capitalism, say in Germany or in Switzerland, actually is much less wasteful of resources. But what happened is that after about 1990, the US invested a lot of effort in exporting what was called the Washington Consensus, So basically exporting an American model of capitalism to the rest of the world. And that is the model that we bought into, even though no model could be worse suited to Indian conditions, because this is a model that is founded fundamentally on, people suddenly populating a very large, resource-rich continent. Out of that grows all these incredible wasteful patterns of expenditure and resource use.
Amitav, you contrast the rather wishy-washy nature of the Paris Agreement, although it has, as you say, the positive aspect is that it should close the debate on whether, in fact, climate change is man-made or not. But the document is bereft of hard, concrete, plans of action. You contrast that with the Pope's Laudato Si encyclical. What is it you think the Pope is saying that the world is not getting yet, the rest of us don't get?
The Pope is talking about changing our ways of living, changing our patterns of thought, changing our patterns of desire. And that, I think anyone who looks at this issue very seriously can see that without that, if we don't jettison this model of economy, this model of consumption, we are going to devour the planet like locusts, as Gandhiji predicted, 60, 70 years ago. And that is exactly what we see is coming to be. As opposed to the Pope's Laudato Si, and I must say the papal encyclical is, I think, the single most important document ever written on climate change. It's a amazingly well-written document. It's very clear. It's filled with humanity, with a concern for poverty and justice. All of this is completely lacking in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement really places all its faith on technology. It creates all these windows for commercialization of climate change. Climate justice is completely swept under the rug. The possibility of reparations in the long run is also completely ruled out. I mean, in all these senses, it's even a departure from the Framework Convention, and earlier conventions that the world has had on climate change. The Kyoto Convention speaks of market failures. There's no such recognition in the Paris Agreement.
It's quite a squalid compromise at the end of the day. I mean, I think they wanted to push an agreement through.
The Americans basically pushed through an agreement that was to their benefit, and the world fell in line. Essentially, this is the climate version of all these trade agreements of the last 20 years. It's WTO, NAFTA, TPP. The only hopeful thing is that, people in the West even are now rising up against that kind of neoliberalism.
If politicians aren't going to be able to show the way, and the Pope in his own way has done it, but the Pope occupies a rather unique place in the world of Christianity, which perhaps other major world religions like Islam and Hinduism, they don't accord space for that kind of a person. But do you think it's important that we hear voices from within Islam and Hinduism as well, Buddhism, other major world religions that could push this particular view on climate change? And if we haven't heard, why are we not hearing it?
Well, from Buddhism, the Dalai Lama has certainly spoken about it, and there are, I think, several actually very active Buddhist groups, addressing climate change issues. There are some small Hindu groups which have come together to address climate change. Similarly, there are several small Muslim groups which have also spoken on climate change. But actually, it's the fact is that there is no major either Muslim figure or Hindu figure who is tackling this subject at all. To the contrary, I think both in India and in many parts of the Middle East, we are completely in the grip of this, you might call a frenzied consumerism.
But what do you say to the argument of, I mean, you hear it often in India. And India, incidentally, whatever the global perception may be, is not a country that is wedded to unnecessarily wasteful consumption. I mean, you have a lot of examples of it, but there is increasingly a sense that we need to be frugal in terms of consuming resources. Even government policy, which was rather slow moving, has in recent years had a focus, a new focus on renewables and so on and so forth. But when the government or when politicians say, look, at the end of the day, we have an obligation to lift our people out of poverty, and if that means having a coal-fired station, we can't not do that because we have an obligation to our people. You, of course, refer to those kinds of arguments, but what would your answer be to this kind of argumentation?
Look, if there were perfect justice in the world, every time we opened a coal-fired plant, one would be shut down in the US or the UK or the EU, because they actually have the technology. They can make these switches quite easily. But there is no perfect justice in the world, and it's not. And as we can see, the Paris Agreement has swept this completely under the rug. So there are two aspects of this. One is that we can wait around, and we should insist on justice in these matters. But at the same time, there's an immediate issue of survival. When that great cyclone comes racing towards Mumbai, what are you going to say? That you're coming to the wrong place? Go somewhere else? We are not the ones who created you. When these terrible droughts happen, what are we going to do? It's a problem that we are left to deal with. So yes, on the one hand, there's the whole question of mitigation. And that is perhaps best addressed by experts of various kinds. But on the other hand, there's something we can see in front of our eyes, which is that we can and must create structures of resiliency, We must, for example, prepare our major cities for these dramatic rainfall events, for possible storms, cyclones. We have to create some resiliency for drought. We have to put these measures in place because, when these disasters happen, we tend to think that it's just a one-off thing, but it's not. It's going to happen again and again.
Right. Every year we confront them. So in a way you're saying, common but differentiated responsibility remains the mantra at the global level. as far as driving an international agreement in the future, but each country, each set of policymakers have a responsibility to do what they can in their own
constituencies.
Exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely in their own constituencies. Just for example, just to make sure that whatever city they're from, whatever part of the country they're from, that there is disaster preparedness. And actually, our disaster preparedness in some parts of the country have grown better. But there is no disaster preparedness in our cities. That is something really, really worrying in the long run, because you think of what a gigantic task it would be to evacuate Mumbai. Suppose a superstorm like Hurricane Sandy were coming towards Mumbai, and actually one of the impacts of climate change, one of the predicted impacts of climate change, is that cyclonic activity will increase in the Arabian Sea. So it's not at all a far-fetched thing, that a big storm could hit Mumbai. How do you evacuate Mumbai? And remember, Mumbai is, as an economist writes, it represents a huge concentration of risk, because so much of our industrial infrastructure is there, our commercial infrastructure, the Reserve Bank headquarters, the stock exchange.
Nuclear power plants around there.
Nuclear power plants on either side of the city. So it is an enormous concentration of risk. And if we don't put in place, some measures of preparedness, we are going to pay a terrible, terrible price in the long run.
On that sobering note, Amitav Ghosh, we'll have to end it there, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Well, just to remind our viewers, The Great Derangement, it's a great, important book. Go out and read it. I think the argument for concerted action on climate change has never been made any better. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.